Hello, ambitious professionals. I'm Teegan Bartos, founder of Jolt Your Career. I work with mid to senior level professionals who are looking for professional success, financial stability, and personal fulfillment. I am excited to have Sasha with me today because let's face it, no matter how hard you try to focus on things, um, how hard you try not to focus on things that are you can't control. Sometimes you just have those lingering questions that eat at you. So today, Sasha is going to give us an inside look into the world of executive recruiting. So Sasha, thank you so much for joining me today. Can you introduce your background for our viewers?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Tegan, for having me on here. It's a pleasure. I've actually spent a little over 9 years in executive recruitment. I kind of fell into it right after college and fell in love with it, right? It's almost like a matchmaking service, right? You find a great candidate for a great organization and the perfect role. And so I started off as a generalist and I worked mostly in industrial with some finance background. I did some searches in Latin America and then really started to focus more on that consumer and industrial practice, right? Did some private equity as well. And then ended up moving full-time to the industrial practice. And that's really kind of where I find my passion. And that's going to really be from kind of that emerging leadership to those executive positions within an organization. So really it's about understanding the company culture, what they're looking for, the skill sets, and some of the even soft skill sets that a candidate has to make sure that it's a good fit for the organization and a good fit for the candidate as well.
So what is your process for finding a candidate for your rec?
Yeah, so, I think that it's a two-part approach, right? So we do have postings, right? That is minimum requirements and nice to haves. And so there are some candidates that are actively searching in the market right now. And then another approach is as we look at an organization, what are some organizations that are similar to whether it's size, whether it's practice, whether it's maybe an engineering function, right? And seeing what companies can relate and would easily translate into that role. And from there, we identify candidates that would fit those minimum requirements and could be a good fit. And we engage them in conversation because they're passive and they are, potentially interested in having a conversation, right, about the opportunity. And so it's kind of a hybrid approach, if you will, in finding some candidates that are currently looking for a new opportunity and a change in their career, and also contacting candidates that, are just happy in their current role and, are made aware of a new opportunity.
Nice. So for those candidates who maybe didn't apply to your position that you're seeking through a pipeline, what stands out on either the resume that you get a hold of or their LinkedIn profile? How are you finding these people?
Yes. So, primarily it's through LinkedIn, which is a great reminder for any of those that are seeking a change or are looking for recruiters to reach out to update your information on LinkedIn, right? And that's really filling in some of the key highlights and achievements that you've done in your career. In addition, when we're looking at passive candidates, I think what we're looking for is one, that they meet those minimum requirements, but also people that have filled out their LinkedIn profiles, right? The more information you have on there, the more I know if this role would be a fit for you, the size and scope of your responsibility as it relates to the organization. I also look for stability. When I think about hiring someone for an organization, they want this person to be able to grow and be able to invest resources and learning opportunities for this candidate. And they don't necessarily want this person to leave in 6 months to a year, right? And so some of those transitions, we have to be a little bit more thoughtful about where we're going in our careers and what the end goal is before making any transition. Because at some point, there could be a financial incentive into making a change, but eventually you're going to cap out, right? And you're going to have to decide what's more important. And you're also going to start being passed up for opportunities because they're not willing to have to retrain someone in 6 months to a year if they think you're going to end up leaving. And so I look for longevity. I look for added responsibility, right? So every transition should be either a different space, an industry, a size and scope increase, a management position, really adding to your skill set and really rounding off some of the skills that you need in order to achieve your end goal, right? Whether that's, becoming a director in finance, or whether that's, becoming the next chief marketing officer, right? It really just ends up, and you can start from, even being a manager, right? And what are the skills, what's the education that you're putting into it? If you have a 4-year degree, have you taken any other certifications? What has been that, continued learning that has continued to elevate your experience? And so those are all things that you look for in a LinkedIn profile. So reminder to always fill out your LinkedIn profile so that recruiters can contact you for appropriate level jobs. I know some people get contacted by recruiters for a position that's maybe below what they're looking for. And I think that's just, a sign that maybe we need to revamp, how you've labeled your information on LinkedIn. We really want to share some of those details without going into confidential information, right. But kind of giving a range or an estimate of some of the size and responsibilities that you have, I think would really help you out.
So for everyone watching, make sure you have a strong professional brand on LinkedIn, that you quantify your scopes in regards to your responsibility and your achievements, so that way you get recruiters coming to you. So then a recruiter comes to a candidate, right? And they're having a casual conversation, but it is an interview. I mean, even if it is a casual conversation, it's still, you're being interviewed, and then that candidate also has an opportunity to interview you and learn more about your role in your company and things like that. So what stands out to you in the initial interview call with a candidate?
Yeah, and we have a lot of exploratory conversations with candidates, right? And it's getting a better sense of their background, their size and scope, if something's unclear in their resume. I think one of the things that candidates don't realize is that it is an interview in a sense, right? Understanding your executive presence, how you come off professionally, how you articulate your background, how you can weave a story about your experiences, and how you would make an impact in the organization. The other aspect that really, I think, stands out is you having a good understanding of the company that you're interviewing for. So, if you come into the interview and you don't know anything about the organization, take an hour out of your day, Google search, look at some YouTube, look at their Instagram page, their LinkedIn, things like that to get familiar with the organization. Find out what's been in the news, right? What they're, obviously if it's a public company, there's more information. But even with smaller companies, right? What are they into? What industry? What's emerging? What are some trends? What do their customers look like? Who are they targeting? And really be able to express the interest in the role. I have had many candidates where we've had a really good conversation, and at the end, I asked them about their interest in an organization, or what caused, them to apply to a position, or why they would be interested in making a change. And, they've said financial gains, or they haven't really had any, they don't know enough about the organization to really say, or maybe they just want to relocate, right? And so, there is obviously good reasons for you to make a change, and personal reasons, whether that's economic, whether that's family responsibilities that, tie you to a certain area, or maybe you want to go home. but you definitely want to express why you want to work there, right? And why you're interested and why you're excited about the opportunity, because that's what clients want to hear. That's
Yeah.
what companies want to hear when they're hiring you. They want to know that you're excited to be there, and they're just as excited to have you there. Because I think at the end of the day, you're going to make an impact in an organization, and they want to make sure that you're in there for the good days, but also sometimes there's going to be rough patches, and
Yep.
they don't want you to just turn around and leave. And I think that that's, I think that's where kind of making sure that the culture fit is a good fit, right? Before you go any further. And so I would highly recommend doing your research, and being able to articulate why you want to join an organization.
Yep, I totally agree. Make it about the organization, not about something personal about you. So
Right.
I love that advice. Because sometimes I interview people and I'm like, don't listen to them, but that's great advice. Well, because everybody has different levels to their exposure about the job search process. You're obviously an expert in recruiting and what it takes to have a good interview and a good resume and things like that. What your hiring managers or clients, want to hear about candidates. But sometimes like recruiters have it a little bit easier on their job search because networking is huge when it comes to recruitment and getting roles in recruitment, but it's a little bit different for roles outside of recruitment. So
Sure.
I love that advice. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Okay, so candidates go through the initial screening with you, and then you have a long list of hiring managers, right? So what is your process in presenting candidates to hiring managers? Do you say 1,000 people applied and here they all are, or, here are the top 30 or top 7, or how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So when there is a position, there are specific requirements. And so from a compliance standpoint, we have to make sure that those candidates meet those minimum requirements to even be considered. So when you're looking at a posting, I would recommend updating and editing your resume before submitting it, because that is what is going to allow you to have visibility for the role. That's not to say that you'll be contacted every time, but it at least gives you the opportunity of being viewed. You don't want to necessarily focus on how many applications you submitted in a week if you're trying to get a new job. It's about quality, not quantity. So you want to make sure that you're making it as easy for a recruiter to identify you as a qualified candidate. With that being said, when I'm looking at a candidate and they meet those minimum requirements, I kind of note it and put it to the side. And then you continue to go through all the qualified candidates and do that for the rest of the candidates. And so then you have a pool of candidates that meet those minimum requirements. And then you look at the nice to haves, right? Who has that specific industry experience, or who has that global experience, or who's been in that industry or understands certain customer segments. And then from there, you kind of narrow it down even more, right? And so then you come up with a short list of, probably 8 to 10 candidates that you will review with the hiring manager. And then from there, you go through their backgrounds and see where there may be gaps, or what they like about certain profiles, what they dislike, what questions they have about candidates' experiences, or maybe there's a gap in employment that they'd like to understand, what kind of caused that transition, or what they were doing in the interim, right?
Okay.
And then from there, that's when we start having conversations with candidates.
Gotcha. So is that when they start having conversations with the hiring manager, or like a second round with you?
So that would be the first round, right?
Okay.
I have a conversation with them, go through their backgrounds, ensure that they're meeting those minimum requirements, and that they're interested in the role, right? That they're interested in the organization, that it would be a good culture fit, and ensuring that they really have some of the things that we're looking for, whether that's a turnaround situation, whether that's leading a large team, maybe specific skill sets that weren't readily available on their resume, but probably do have that experience just based on scope.
Okay.
And then from there, that would go to the hiring manager. So that could either lead into an interview with multiple team members, or it could actually be a phone conversation. If there is a lot of internal and external interest, then you would try to narrow down the slate even more before bringing people on site. Pre-COVID, of course.
Yeah.
Bringing people on site for in-depth interviews. And then from there, you might have a second or even a third round, depending on the level of the opportunity, right? Where you may meet a VP or a function as kind of that final round.
Awesome.
And from
Okay.
there, you move to that offer stage.
Awesome. So I'm sure there's a lot of people watching who go through this process and then are like, I did all that, but then I heard nothing. So why do recruiters ghost candidates?
That's a great question, right? And I think, it's a fair question to ask. I will say that, for the level of opportunities that I do, I definitely have to have that interaction with candidates and give them feedback on interviews or why we're not moving forward. However, I think most recruiters in the industry are heavily are managing quite a few recs, right? They're probably managing anywhere from 30 to even 50 recs at a time. So although it's definitely not professional to ghost candidates, I do think it happens and it falls through the cracks. I would recommend candidates to reach out to the candidate or to the recruiter and actually ask for feedback. I think a lot of the times as well, some recruiters don't like giving bad news, and instead of dealing with that at face value, they kind of skirt the situation, which is detrimental to both aspects, right? It's not a good customer experience, a candidate experience, and it's also not good for the candidate, right? They can't improve upon what they don't know was an issue or a concern. Sometimes candidates in an interviewing process will say odd things and doesn't resonate with the hiring manager or the hiring team or the culture of the organization. Sometimes their examples can be vague and not specific enough or not well-rounded enough. Sometimes it can be leadership attributes, how they manage their team or how they managed a concern or a challenge that didn't really resonate with their team members or didn't feel inclusive. And I think when we provide those responses to candidates, most of the time I find that candidates can be really receptive because it's really hard to give constructive feedback. But the truth is that without that, they're not able to take that learning opportunity and improve upon for their next interview.
Right.
There are the cases where there are some candidates that react badly. And that's, again, a sign that it's not a good culture fit. Sometimes, although interviews can sometimes go sideways and it could be nerves, it could be just a bad day, right? I think that's one of the things that we need to improve upon, of understanding this was just one interview of many. There could be future opportunities with this organization. So you always want to make sure that you leave a good impression and understand that, there could be another opportunity around the corner. You want them to think about you. But that being said, I think that, it's an unfortunate aspect of recruiting. I think a lot of recruiters get a bad reputation from, having ghosted candidates or not returning calls. I would not take it personal, but I understand how that can be very frustrating from a candidate experience. And all I can say is, definitely reach out if you're able to the recruiter and get that feedback. I think sometimes just a reminder from a recruiter standpoint can go a long way, and they may be able to provide you with some feedback.
Nice. So that's kind of like the bad side of it. But let's talk about something fun. So what is your favorite interview question to ask, and what has been the best response to it?
Oh, that is, oh, now you're gonna test my memory here. Let me see. I think it honestly really depends on the role, right? So, I will say that for one example, when I'm doing marketing roles, which are extremely fun and very sales oriented and friendly and digital friendly for that matter, social media, I like to ask questions like, what's the best project that you've ever worked on? And I think one of the things that really resonates with recruiters and just overall interviews is authenticity. So when a candidate is really excited about an opportunity or the work that they do, and being able to talk about a lot of innovation, about really getting together with the team and really being able to expand on an idea is really exciting for me. I know that sounds probably very geeky, right? But I do think that just having the opportunity to love and be passionate about the work that you do and being able to resonate with examples about how amazing that project is really fun. I think, it really just depends on the size and scope of the role, but, those questions can vary from function to function.
Yeah. I think that my favorite interview question that I've ever been asked is, what is people's biggest misconception of you? Because it kind of says a lot about areas that you may need to work on without that, boring question, well, what's your weakness? Because that's a terrible interview question.
That is a terrible interview question, but you still get it a lot, actually.
Yep. Recruiters are not all made the same.
Yeah, well, and I also think that is a great question, by the way, because I think it also shares about how you view yourself or how you think others view you, versus the reality of things. And I think that is a great question. I think motivation, I think questions like that almost get to a behavioral standpoint in the interview, which is just interesting overall, right? Of having that genuine conversation. I also think that, one of the things that I've asked, and actually is a pretty good question for candidates even interviewing. I think one of the things that candidates forget is they're interviewing the company too. It's
Yep.
not a one-way street. We have to make sure that it's a good match on both sides, right? Because again, the longevity matters. And
Mm-hmm.
so I would say, one of the questions that, I usually ask candidates, although not a fun question, is, let's say everything works out. Let's say that, the stars align, it's a perfect match, it makes financial sense, your dream job. You know, what's, 6 months down the line, you've been onboarded, what's one of the things that could cause frustration with you?
Oh,
And joining an organization? And I think that's a great question, but you can also turn it around and
yep.
also ask a company, let's say we move forward in the process and I get hired and it's a good fit. What's something that's going to frustrate me in 6 months of being with the organization? Like, what are some frustrations that I may have to deal with?
Yeah.
And I think that also gives you a good sense of the culture, maybe the work that you'll have to be doing, maybe some partnerships that you're going to have to develop or work with, maybe a lot of different personalities. And you just want to make sure that you understand that you're also interviewing. Of course, you want to put your best foot forward, but it's also the company's job to sell you on the opportunities, whether that's growth, whether that's different skill set, education, continued learning. So I think that's all really important.
Yeah, I agree. Asking questions at the end of the interview is even throughout the interview process, is so important to really make sure it is a good fit, because a lot of time, well, pre-pandemic, I primarily worked with candidates that were looking to level up. But right now, there's so many candidates who are, have been impacted by the pandemic, and they're like, I just need to get a job. I just need to get a job. But it's like, wait a minute, just because you don't like one aspect of your job, or just because you don't like the situation that you're in with the pandemic, doesn't mean you want to get into a situation that you're not going to enjoy, because you're going to go through the process again. So instead of being narrow focused, have a holistic view and try to get an idea of what you're going to be doing. And like you said earlier on, for a public company, there's so much research you can do, because those reports are public. So you can just Google that and find out where they're at, what their company structure is, where their revenue's at, what are they currently working on. And it can give you so much detail into what you need to expect. And I feel like, especially at an executive level, or even if you are an emerging leader, that's going to be the expectation of the hiring manager, that you're going to go in there and have some type of an understanding about the organization, have done that research, or ask those recruiters those types of questions, so you can really have a meaningful conversation and a high level conversation versus an entry level conversation.
Yeah, a surface level conversation. You want to be sure to ask questions about the organization, right? One of the things, even in interviews or that exploratory conversation with candidates, usually if you don't have any questions, that's not a good sign, right?
Yep.
You don't know the organization. There has to be, have 2 to 3 questions. And that goes with every interview. You may run out of time. You may not have the opportunity to ask those questions, but I would highly recommend not having
Yeah.
questions, because that is just not a good sign, right? There's
Yep.
so many aspects in a role, in an organization, in a company, in a culture. There has to be something you're curious about to know more about. And I think that also says that you're eager to learn and understand more about the role.
Yeah. So one question that people either want to get to right away or totally avoid is compensation. So right now with the pandemic, a lot of higher level professionals take into consideration their bonus, but a lot of companies aren't doing bonuses right now due to the pandemic. So when people are looking at overall comp and that conversation comes up, so a lot of my job seekers that I work with will say, well, the recruiter asked me what are my salary expectations and I don't even know what the role is. Or they'll say, well, I don't want to lowball it, or I don't want to highball it. So what would be your advice, or what is your preference that candidates do when you bring up comp, or do you bring up comp?
I do bring up compensation expectations, right? I think it's important, especially in that emerging leader executive position, to really set expectations and make sure that you're talking about similar compensation structures versus being completely overqualified or not meeting that mark, right, of what they're seeking. And so I do think it's important to have those conversations. I think I'm in a different aspect of just having those conversations just because I'm so used to having them. So it doesn't really make a factor or an impact for me, because I'm just making sure that you're not going through the entire recruiting process. Interview process is intense,
Mm-hmm.
and getting to the final stages and having sticker shock, right? Of this is not at all what I thought, right? And so those are the conversations that we're trying to avoid in final stages, right?
Yeah.
As well as your time, right? And the resources you invest in the interviewing process. One of the things that I would say is, I think that's where the questions come in, right? So titles can vary from company to company, and it's saying, okay, well, let's take a step back. Maybe you haven't had a chance to ask questions about the role, right? You say, maybe you applied for a role, but you still need more context and you didn't get to that part of the interview. I think it's fair for you to say, let's take a step back, and I want to better understand the role, the scope as it relates to mine, because I think that's really what's going to make a difference. The other aspect is, I think that you should be comfortable with sharing where you'd like to be. I mean, we also have some people that want to, shoot for the moon. And, if the role calls for that, sure. But also you want to be careful not to price yourself out. So I think, you have to have a serious conversation with yourself of what are your expectations? What are you seeking as you think about new opportunities? Because once you know your threshold and what you're looking and what you just cannot take a step back, I think that's what's important, right? And I think that's why some of the legislation that has passed in the last few years has passed, to make sure that you're being compensated for what you're looking for. And hey, if you're over the compensation, the recruiter is going to let you know, right?
Yeah.
And they're going to say, that's not really aligned with this role. And perhaps you're flexible. And so you can say, well, let's talk about it more. Like, what does that mean for you, right? And see where it kind of sits within the organization. But I think what they're trying to avoid is they're not trying to do a pre-negotiation with you. They're not trying to, lowball you, but they want to make sure that it's aligned with the market analysis that their organization has done. I mean, most organizations have salary grades or salary bands, right? And so those aren't really flexible, right? There's a range, but at the same time, there's also a market expectation. And so I think that's a conversation that you have to have with yourself, with your family, as you think about new opportunities, because I think what you want to do is be fair to yourself.
Yeah. And there are so many resources out there like payscale.com and other things where you can put in your location and the company that you're applying to. And there's so much data out there, or Glassdoor, for example. So,
right. Exactly.
So would you say give a range or give a number?
I would say give a range, but I would, yes, give a range, but I would break it down between base, bonus, and long-term incentive if you have that already or are looking to get that, right?
Okay.
Because I think when you talk about total compensation, some companies can have a heavier bonus, some people can have a lighter bonus, and so that can vary, right?
Okay.
So understanding where you're flexible in and where your hard stop is for your base. If you're not willing to take a step back, don't take a role unless you are passionate about the organization, the opportunity, and that you feel like you can go, have some growth opportunity within the organization. Because again, that money is okay for now, but you're not going to be happy in the long term. And then you're going to end up making a transition, which then to something that maybe you do love or are passionate about, and you're going to have to take a step back. Right. And so, depending on what you're seeking, I think at the end of the day, you just really have to know yourself and what you're seeking. And sure, sometimes there are mistakes, right? You join an organization and maybe it was misrepresented, or maybe you didn't know until you joined that that's not what you wanted to do, and have a change of heart. And I think that's fair. I think that's something that, you have to discover in yourself as you contemplate new opportunities.
I agree. Yep. So, some of the questions that I've been getting are things like, okay, I was laid off in March and I'm still unemployed 6 months, 8 months later. How, like from a recruiter's perspective, how does that impact how you feel about that candidate? Is it like, okay, well, we're in a pandemic, or is it, well, if you were a good candidate, they would have made room for you, or if you were a good candidate, you would have found something by now?
Yes. I think that's really difficult to say right now with everything going on. And, I think so many good people are in transition, have been laid off. Companies have restructured. A lot of organizations are struggling and are trying to do their best in these challenging times. So by no means do I think candidates that are unemployed are not qualified or, lacking in skills by any means. I think that it's a very difficult time on what's happening in our country. I think, the COVID situation has really impacted the economy. Businesses have shut down, flight, hospitality. have really struggled, right? As well as other organizations. And as we think about it, one of the things that I would recommend when you do have a gap that large, or even if you go on to a year, is having something in the interim. And that could be doing some consulting work. That could be going back to school. That could be not necessarily full time, but going back and maybe getting a certification, or maybe doing some nonprofit work, something that fills in that gap, right? What companies don't want to see is necessarily just the gap, right? So there has to be a reason you didn't have a role. Obviously, that could have been out of your control financially. Organizations do reorgs, it happens.
Yeah.
But really, what are you doing to fill that gap, to continue to upscale your skill set, to continue to keep learning, right? And that's what we want to know, right? Although this has happened to you, you're making the best of it and taking this time to really absorb information, continue education, or have started your own company. Maybe you do some project work, which is, I think, perfectly normal. And I think it also shows a different side of you, right? Someone that isn't going to just stand on the sidelines, is going to get right into it and, be aggressive and try to make something happen for themselves, even with the economy being the way that it is. And I think that's what companies want to see.
Sasha, you could be a career coach. You give great advice.
Well, I appreciate it. I think I have an easy person to talk to, so it's a pleasure.
So, Sasha, before we wrap up, is there anything else you would like to share with someone who has been impacted by the pandemic and, is kind of low right now?
Yeah, I say hang in there. I think a lot of people are in the same situation. So, although it seems like it's never ending, I do think that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. In addition, I think I would primarily focus on quality applications instead of quantity, right? Make sure that you're meeting those minimum requirements. And if you have them and they're not listed on the resume, please just take a few minutes, update your resume, tailor it to the job description to make it as easy as possible so that you can increase your chances of at least getting that exploratory conversation. And then it's really up to you to do the research, really get to an understanding of the organization, have some of those questions about the opportunity to really present yourself in the best light, right? And you also want to think about your career as it relates to the job description, as it relates to the requirements, so that you can give those specific highlights, right? I know you can't put everything in your resume. We wish you could. And we also have a limited amount of time. So we really want to make the best use of that small window that we have, which is showing your personality, showing your authentic self, showing the highlights of your career and how it relates, and showing your interests, right? In the organization, and being curious about learning more about the organization to make sure it aligns with what you're seeking as a job seeker, as an employee that could grow within the organization. So I definitely think that there's opportunities and there's definitely a way to stand out.
Awesome advice. Well, for all of those who tuned in and are watching this, we wish you the best of luck on your job search. Sasha dropped some gems. Definitely take her advice from start to finish. There isn't anything that I would say, maybe reconsider that. Great advice, Sasha, and thank you so much for your time this evening.
All right. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.